Marcus Carter pushed open the glass doors of Sterling Motors, the sharp hum of the air conditioning greeting him as he stepped into the immaculate showroom. The space gleamed under the warm glow of overhead lights, a cathedral of luxury cars displayed like art. He took in the scene with a quiet pride that came from years of hard work, the kind of relentless grind that most people never see. This moment, standing here with the means to buy his dream car, should have felt like a victory lap. But something was off. The atmosphere, instead of welcoming, carried a subtle edge that Marcus couldn't ignore. The whispered voices of two salesmen cut through the low hum of the showroom. He glanced toward the desk where they stood, their postures lazy but their eyes sharp, darting his way with a mix of amusement and disdain. The shorter one, an older man with a practiced sneer, leaned closer to his colleague, and they exchanged a laugh that felt deliberately loud. Marcus adjusted his stance and ignored them. His attention returned to the reason he was here. A sleek electric sedan at the center of the room, its glossy black surface so polished it reflected the lights above like a mirror. The car was everything he had envisioned: cutting-edge technology, elegant design, and a symbol of how far he had come. Yet even as his heart raced with anticipation, he could feel their judgment, like a weight pressing against his back. The sound of deliberate footsteps broke his focus. Marcus turned to see one of the salesmen approaching. The older one, his name tag reading Rick, walked with a deliberate slowness, a half-smile playing on his lips. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned Marcus from head to toe, as though cataloging every perceived flaw. "You lost, buddy?" Rick asked, his tone casual but loaded with condescension. "We don't really cater to window shoppers here." The words landed with a sting that Marcus hadn't expected. His first instinct was to fire back, but he held himself in check. He knew better than to let the man see his irritation. Instead, Marcus met Rick's gaze with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly who he was. "I'm not here to browse," Marcus replied, his voice even. "I'm here to buy." For a split second, Rick's smirk faltered, but it quickly returned, this time more pronounced. He let out a short laugh, glancing over his shoulder as though sharing a joke with someone who wasn't there. "Oh, really?" he said, drawing the words out mockingly. "Look, these cars aren't cheap. We don't do test drives for everyone, you know what I mean. Policies and all that." The statement was layered with implications Marcus couldn't ignore. It wasn't about test drives. It wasn't even about the car. It was about Rick's assumption, clear as day, that Marcus didn't belong here, that he wasn't worth their time. The weight of that judgment hit harder than the salesman's dismissive tone. "I didn't ask for a test drive," Marcus said evenly, refusing to give Rick the satisfaction of a reaction. "I said I'm here to buy. Maybe you should start by asking me what I'm looking for." Rick chuckled, the kind of laugh meant to diminish, to turn a serious moment into a joke at someone else's expense. He crossed his arms, his smile widening. "All right, buddy, humor me. What exactly are you looking to buy?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, watching as Rick's confidence began to waver under his unflinching stare. Finally, Marcus nodded toward the electric sedan, its sleek form gleaming under the showroom lights. "That one," he said simply. Rick followed his gaze, then turned back to Marcus, his smirk now tinged with disbelief. "That's quite a car," he said, his tone heavy with doubt. "You sure about that?" Marcus didn't blink. "Absolutely." Rick seemed to hesitate for a moment, but the arrogance quickly returned. He gave a half shrug, his condescension barely veiled. "Well, like I said, we don't let just anyone test drive these. Why don't you come back when you're—" He paused, searching for the right word. before settling on one that dripped with derision. Ready. The implications stung more than Marcus cared to admit, but he didn't let it show. He was no stranger to this kind of treatment. He had seen it in boardrooms when pitching to investors, in subtle dismissals disguised as polite declines, and in countless other moments where people assumed they knew his worth based on nothing but the surface. Still, this felt different. This wasn't just a quiet slight. It was a public humiliation. Other customers in the showroom glanced his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort, as though witnessing a scene they weren't sure how to interpret. For a moment, Marcus considered calling Rick out, laying his financial success bare in a way that would leave no doubt about his ability to buy any car in the showroom. But he quickly dismissed the thought. He didn't need to prove anything. Not to Rick. Not to anyone. His success spoke for itself. What mattered now wasn't what he said, but what he chose to do next. Thanks for your time, Marcus said finally, his tone polite but firm. He turned and began walking toward the exit, his steps measured and deliberate. The temptation to look back, to see Rick's reaction, was strong, but Marcus resisted. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle people like Rick was to let them drown in their own assumptions. As the glass doors swung shut behind him, Marcus stepped into the sunlight and took a deep breath. The sting of the interaction lingered, but so did something else. A resolve, sharp and unyielding. He glanced back at the dealership, its polished facade gleaming in the midday light. This wasn't over. No, not by a long shot. They'd be happy to settle for a fallen luxury, but the more Marcus swung around, the more it ripped him to pieces. His screams for vengeance passed in the night and fast away from his mind, and frenzied sweat pooled at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't all about them. Marcus was certain of that. That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the quiet hum of the city outside providing a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his mind. He stared at the untouched dinner in front of him, his appetite lost to the churn of emotions. The laughter, the sneers, and the smirk of that salesman replayed in his head like a looped video. As the minutes passed, the sting began to transform into something else, a burning resolve. He wasn't new to prejudice. Throughout his life, he had navigated the subtle and overt slights that came with being a successful black man in spaces where people like him were often underestimated. Yet this incident had hit differently. It wasn't just personal. It felt like a slap in the face to every person who had walked into a room like that and been judged unworthy before they even had a chance to speak. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing with determination. This wasn't something he could let slide. Pulling his laptop closer, Marcus began to research Sterling Motors. At first it was just curiosity, an urge to know more about the dealership that had treated him so poorly. But as he scrolled through online reviews, something unsettling began to emerge. There, buried among the generic complaints about pricing and service, were several reviews that painted a disturbing picture. Phrases like dismissive staff, rude treatment, and biased attitudes leapt off the screen. What stood out most were the demographics of the reviewers. Most of them were minorities. One review in particular caught his attention. Felt like I was being judged the moment I walked in. Salespeople didn't take me seriously and acted like I couldn't afford anything. I've never been so humiliated. The words hit uncomfortably close to home. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read more, the pattern becoming clearer with each review. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a culture of gatekeeping, of perpetuating the idea that certain people didn't belong in certain spaces, he sat back, his mind racing. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about holding Sterling Motors, and places like it, accountable. It was about sending a message that no one should have to endure that kind of treatment, simply because of the way they looked or the assumptions people made about them. Marcus didn't just want to fight back. He wanted to make a difference. But he knew that to do so, he needed a plan. Retaliation for the sake of revenge wasn't his style. If he was going to act, it had to be calculated, purposeful, and impactful. Marcus began to jot down ideas in his notebook. First, he wrote down the facts of what had happened to him, ensuring every detail was clear and accurate. Then he listed the reviews and complaints he'd found, marking the most damning ones to use as examples. He couldn't be the only one to connect the dots, but he knew that most people wouldn't have the time or energy to dig into something like this. That's where he could make a difference, by compiling and presenting the evidence in a way that couldn't be ignored. He reached for his phone and called Rachel, a longtime friend and one of the brightest marketing minds he knew. Rachel had been by his side during the early days of his startup, helping him craft campaigns that turned a fledgling idea into a thriving business. If anyone could help him turn this experience into a teachable moment, it was her. "Marcus!" Rachel's voice came through, warm but slightly concerned. It wasn't often he called her this late. "What's up?" Hey, Rachel, I need your help with something," Marcus began, his tone serious. He quickly explained what had happened at the dealership, sparing no detail. Rachel listened quietly, her occasional hums of acknowledgement the only interruptions. When he finished, there was a pause before she spoke. "Well, that's infuriating," she said, her voice sharp with indignation. "And you're right. It's not just about you, it's about a pattern, and it's about calling it out. So, what's the plan?" Marcus smiled faintly. That was what he loved about Rachel. She didn't waste time on empty sympathies. "I want to hold them accountable," he said, "but I don't want it to be a screaming match. I want to make them face their biases in a way they can't ignore." Rachel's voice brightened with a spark of interest. "Okay, let's think this through. First, we need to document everything. Reviews, testimonials, anything we can use to establish a pattern. Then, we'll need visibility. Have you considered involving the media?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. "I don't want to come across as someone just trying to stir up trouble." Rachel scoffed. "You're not. You're standing up for yourself and for everyone else who's been through the same thing. Don't downplay that." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "You're right. And yeah, I've thought about it. There's a local journalist who covers stories on racial bias in business. I think this might be right up her alley." "Perfect," Rachel said, her enthusiasm growing. "And while you're at it, let's make this a teaching moment. Maybe we can propose something constructive, like training programs or partnerships with organizations that focus on equity and customer service. That way, it's not just criticism, it's a push for real change." Marcus felt a swell of gratitude for her insight. "That's exactly what I was thinking. Thanks, Rachel. I'll keep you updated." As the call ended, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind clearer than it had been all evening. The fire inside him hadn't dimmed, but now it was focused, channeled into something productive. This wasn't just about getting an apology or making a point. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had, not at Sterling Motors, and hopefully not anywhere else. He glanced at his notes again, the beginnings of a plan taking shape. Tomorrow, he thought, the real work begins. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the glow of his laptop screen casting a faint light on his determined face. The conversation with Rachel had been energizing, and now his mind buzzed with ideas. He wasn't just planning to address what had happened. He was setting the stage for something larger. This wasn't about revenge. It was about creating a moment that would force Sterling Motors to confront its culture of bias head-on. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name of Rebecca Lynn, a reporter for a local news station. Rebecca was known for her sharp investigative skills and for fearlessly highlighting systemic issues, especially those tied to discrimination. If anyone could help amplify this story, it was her. Marcus hesitated for a moment before dialing. He knew involving the media was a bold step, and there was always the risk of the narrative spiraling out of control. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting the humiliation fester in silence, outweighed his doubts. Rebecca Lynn, a brisk voice answered on the second ring. "Hi, Rebecca. This is Marcus Carter. We met at the entrepreneur panel last year," he said, his voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. There was a pause before her tone softened. "Marcus, of course. How are you? It's been a while." "I'm doing well, thanks," Marcus replied, then cut to the chase. "Listen, something happened recently that I think you might be interested in covering. It's about a local business and their treatment of customers, specifically around bias and discrimination." Rebecca's interest was piqued instantly. "I'm listening. Tell me more." Marcus recounted his experience at Sterling Motors in detail, his voice measured but firm as he described the judgmental treatment, the dismissive attitude, and the broader pattern he had uncovered through customer reviews. Rebecca didn't interrupt, but Marcus could hear the occasional sound of her pen scribbling notes in the background. When he finished, there was a brief silence before Rebecca spoke. "That's infuriating, and sadly not surprising. You're absolutely right. This isn't just about one interaction. It's a systemic issue." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And I want to do more than just call them out. I want to use this as an opportunity to push for real change, but I need your help to make it impactful." Rebecca didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Bend me everything you have. Reviews, testimonials, even the details of your experience. I'll start putting together a story. If you're open to it, I'd also like to film when you confront them again. Nothing aggressive, just a raw, unfiltered look at the moment." Marcus agreed, and after hanging up, he felt a surge of both relief and anticipation. The pieces of the plan were falling into place, but there was still work to do. The next call was to Rachel. "Okay," Rachel said when Marcus finished updating her. "Here's what I'm thinking. You don't just walk in there and rehash what happened. You walk in there as the successful, confident man you are, and you make them see what they refused to see before." "I was thinking the same thing," Marcus said, a smile tugging at his lips. "How do we make it memorable?" Rachel's voice lit up with energy. "We lean into optics. Perception matters, especially in a public space like that. You show up polished and professional, with a presence that commands respect. No jeans and t-shirts this time, and don't go alone. Bring your team, the people who've built your business with you. Show them what success really looks like." Marcus nodded, already envisioning the scene. "And Rebecca will be there too, documenting everything." "Oh, perfect," Rachel said. "But we don't stop there. After the confrontation, we pivot the narrative, propose solutions, diversity training for their staff, partnerships with equity-focused organizations. Make it clear that you're not just calling them out, you're offering a way forward." The idea resonated deeply with Marcus. This wasn't just about making Sterling Motors uncomfortable. It was about pushing them to change, not only for him, but for everyone who walked through their doors in the future. Over the next few days, Marcus worked tirelessly to finalize the plan. He compiled reviews and evidence, carefully selecting the most impactful stories to share with Rebecca. He called his team together, explaining the situation and asking for their support. Every one of them was eager to stand by him, proud to support a leader who didn't back down from injustice. On the morning of the planned visit, Marcus stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the lapels of his tailored navy suit. The reflection staring back at him looked every bit the confident, successful entrepreneur he was, but inside, he felt a flicker of nervousness. He wasn't afraid of the confrontation itself, but of the implications. He wasn't just representing himself today. He was carrying the voices of everyone who had been dismissed, disrespected, or underestimated. When he arrived at Sterling Motors, it wasn't alone. A convoy of sleek SUVs pulled into the dealership's parking lot, the vehicles gleaming in the sunlight. Marcus stepped out first, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. His team followed, each of them dressed impeccably, their presence commanding attention. Behind them, Rebecca and her cameraman exited their car, the lens already rolling. The staff inside Sterling Motors noticed immediately. The smirks and dismissive glances from his last visit were gone, replaced by wide eyes and hurried whispers. Marcus took a deep breath as he approached the glass doors, the weight of the moment settling over him. This wasn't about revenge, it was about resolution. About forcing the dealership to confront its own biases and showing them in no uncertain terms the strength and dignity of the man they had underestimated. With Rachel's words echoing in his mind, "Make them see." Marcus stepped into the showroom, ready to reclaim the narrative. The next day, the hum of luxury engines heralded Marcus's return to Sterling Motors. 3 gleaming SUVs pulled into the dealership's parking lot in synchronized precision, their polished exteriors reflecting the golden glow of the morning sun. The scene was impossible to ignore, and the employees inside the glass-walled showroom were already craning their necks to get a better look. As the vehicles came to a stop directly in front of the entrance, Marcus stepped out of the lead SUV. Gone were the casual jeans and plain t-shirt he had worn the day before. Today he wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, the sharp lines accentuating his confident frame. His polished leather shoes tapped against the asphalt as he adjusted his cufflinks with deliberate ease. This wasn't just an entrance, it was a statement. Behind him, his team exited the other 2 SUVs, each member exuding the same air of professionalism. They moved with purpose, their sharp business attire a visual testament to the success Marcus had built. Rachel followed close behind, her clipboard in one hand and her expression one of cool determination. Rebecca, the reporter, stepped out last, her cameraman already adjusting his lens to capture the unfolding moment. Inside the dealership, Rick and his colleagues stood frozen by the desk, their smug demeanor from the previous day replaced with visible unease. Rick's face flushed as recognition dawned, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Marcus's transformation and the entourage that accompanied him. The reporter's camera added an extra layer of pressure, its unblinking eye a reminder that every move would now be on record. Marcus walked through the glass doors with the same quiet confidence he had displayed before, but this time there was no mistaking the shift in atmosphere. Heads turned as customers and staff alike took in the sight of him and his team. The staff, who had barely glanced his way during his last visit, scrambled to offer forced smiles and polite nods. It was a complete reversal, and Marcus noticed every detail. Rick was the first to step forward, his previously casual posture now stiff with apprehension. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice uneven as he attempted a smile. "Welcome back. How can we assist you today?" Marcus stopped in the middle of the showroom, letting the silence settle for a moment. His gaze swept the room, taking in the staff and their uneasy expressions. Finally, he turned his attention to Rick, his voice calm but firm. "It's interesting," he began, "how different the reception is today compared to yesterday." Rick's face reddened, But before he could respond, Marcus continued. "Yesterday, I was dismissed and mocked. You made assumptions about me without knowing a thing about who I am or why I was here. And it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a culture that needs to change." The room fell silent, the tension thick as the weight of Marcus's words hung in the air. Rachel stepped forward, handing a folder to the dealership manager, who had just emerged from his office, his face pale with concern. The folder contained detailed reviews and complaints Marcus had compiled from other customers who had faced similar treatment. Rebecca's voice broke the silence as she addressed Marcus, her tone measured but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mr. Carter, can you tell us what motivated you to return today?" Marcus turned slightly, addressing Rebecca but ensuring his words resonated with everyone in the room. "I came back because yesterday's experience wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has walked into this dealership and been treated like they didn't belong. I'm here to make it clear that this kind of behavior is unacceptable and to push for real change." The manager, visibly sweating, stepped forward, clutching the folder like a lifeline. "Mr. Carter, I want to apologize on behalf of Sterling Motors. What you experienced yesterday does not align with our values." Marcus's gaze remained steady. "Actions speak louder than words," he replied. "An apology is a start, but it's not enough. I want to see concrete steps taken to address the biases and assumptions that led to yesterday's incident. That includes diversity training for your staff and partnerships with organizations that promote equity and inclusion." The manager nodded hastily. Of course, we'll review everything and implement changes immediately." The exchange unfolded. Rebecca's cameraman captured every moment, the lens focusing on the tension, the gestures, and the shifting expressions of the staff. Customers in the showroom watched intently, some murmuring quietly among themselves. The impact of Marcus' return was undeniable. His presence, his words, and the evidence he presented had created a moment that could not be ignored. Rick, standing awkwardly to the side, avoided Marcus's gaze, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Marcus didn't bother addressing him directly. His point had been made. After a few more tense minutes of conversation, Marcus stepped back, signaling the end of the discussion. "I'll be following up," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I'll be watching to make sure the changes you've promised actually happen." The manager nodded again, his agreement almost frantic. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. We appreciate your feedback and will take immediate action." With that, Marcus turned and walked toward the exit, his team following close behind. The showroom was silent except for the soft click of their shoes against the tile floor. As the glass doors closed behind them, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step towards something larger, something that could inspire change far beyond the walls of Sterling Motors. Rick's steps faltered as he approached, his bravado from the previous day nowhere to be found. His usual smirk had been replaced by an uneasy smile, the corners of his mouth twitching as he struggled to maintain composure. Biting at the news crew flanked by his impeccably dressed team and a news crew was clearly not lost on him. Every movement seemed calculated to avoid further missteps, but Marcus could see through the thin veneer of professionalism. "Welcome back, sir," Rick began, his voice teetering between forced enthusiasm and nervousness. "How can we assist you today?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, the tension growing with each passing second. His gaze moved deliberately around the showroom, taking in the polished cars, the meticulously arranged brochures, and the staff who now watched from the periphery, their postures rigid with unease. When his eyes finally locked on to Rick's, they were steady and unyielding. "You didn't seem too eager to help me yesterday," Marcus said, his tone calm but edged with unmistakable authority. His words carried more weight than volume, each syllable cutting through the air like a blade. Behind him, the reporter's camera captured the exchange, its presence a silent witness to the unfolding reckoning. Rick stammered, his usual confidence unraveling under the intensity of Marcus's gaze. I apologize if there was any misunderstanding," he managed, his voice faltering. We strive to provide excellent service to all our customers." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression both skeptical and unimpressed. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice laced with quiet disbelief. "Let me remind you exactly what happened yesterday. You made assumptions about me before I even had a chance to speak. You dismissed me, mocked me, and made it abundantly clear that you didn't think I was worth your time." Rick opened his mouth, but Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "Spare me the excuses," Marcus continued, his tone unwavering. "I'm not here to hear apologies. I'm here to address a pattern of behavior that goes beyond just me." He gestured to Rachel, who stepped forward with a portfolio in hand. The sharp click of her heels on the tile floor echoed through the silent showroom as she handed the folder to Marcus. Inside were neatly organized documents that painted a damning picture. Marcus's own financial records showing his immense success, a detailed outline of the car he intended to purchase, and testimonials from his team about his leadership and accomplishments. Each page was a counter to the assumptions Rick had made. Marcus opened the portfolio and held it out, letting Rick glance at the contents. "I wanted to give you another chance," Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of purpose. "Not for me, but for everyone you've treated like they don't belong here. For every person who has walked through these doors and been met with the same condescension and dismissal." Rick's face reddened as he glanced at the documents, his discomfort palpable. The weight of the evidence, of Marcus's undeniable success, and the broader implications of his words pressed down on him visibly. He glanced toward the manager, who stood frozen a few steps away, his own expression a mix of embarrassment and concern. Marcus closed the portfolio and handed it to Rachel. "This isn't just about a car," he continued, his voice commanding the attention of everyone in the room. "This is about respect, about creating an environment where every customer is valued, regardless of how they look or what assumptions you make about them." The cameraman adjusted his lens, capturing the moment as Marcus turned to address the manager directly. "I'm here because I believe in accountability. Your dealership has a culture problem, and it needs to change, starting today." The manager, clearly rattled, stepped forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Mr. Carter, I want to sincerely apologize for what you experienced yesterday. I assure you, this is not how we conduct business." Marcus's gaze remained steady, his silence forcing the manager to continue. We are committed to addressing this," the manager said, his voice unsteady. "I'd like to personally oversee your purchase and ensure you receive the service you deserve." Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the gesture, but leaving no doubt that he wasn't there for empty promises. "It's a start," he said, "but it's not enough. I want to see real change. Diversity training for your staff, partnerships with organizations that focus on equity, and a clear commitment to treating every customer with the respect they deserve." The manager nodded quickly, his agreement almost frantic. "Absolutely. We'll take immediate steps to implement those changes." Marcus studied him for a moment, then turned his attention back to Rick. "And as for you," he said, his voice dropping slightly, the intensity of his gaze forcing Rick to meet his eyes. "This is your opportunity to do better. Not just for the next customer who walks through those doors, but for yourself. You have a choice to make. one that goes beyond this moment." Rick swallowed hard, his face a mix of shame and discomfort. He nodded mutely, the words he couldn't seem to find hanging in the air between them. Marcus stepped back, signaling that the confrontation was over. He had said what needed to be said, and the ball was now in their court. As he turned toward the exit, the silence in the showroom was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the cameraman's equipment. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about creating a ripple, a moment of reckoning that would leave a lasting impact. As Marcus pushed open the glass doors and stepped into the sunlight, he felt the weight of the day lift slightly from his shoulders. He wasn't done yet, but this was a start. And he was just getting started. The glass walls of the dealership office reflected the unfolding drama as Thomas, the middle-aged manager with thinning hair and a creased suit, stepped into the fray. His usually composed demeanor had dissolved into visible discomfort as he took in the scene. Marcus, commanding the room with his calm yet unrelenting presence. Rick, standing awkwardly to the side, his face flushed with embarrassment. And a growing crowd of customers and employees, their curiosity drawn to the palpable tension in the air. "Mr. Carter," Thomas began, his voice carefully measured, though it cracked slightly under pressure. "Let me first offer my sincerest apologies for what happened yesterday. That behavior is unacceptable and does not reflect the values of Sterling Motors." Thomas's words spilled out quickly, each syllable seemingly designed to diffuse the situation. His hands wrung together as though trying to physically squeeze out a resolution. "We pride ourselves on customer service and inclusivity. I assure you, this is not the experience we want any of our customers to have." Marcus listened, his expression unreadable, his posture resolute. He didn't interrupt, letting Thomas's apologies stretch into a series of half-formed reassurances about how the dealership would address the issue internally. When the manager paused, clearly expecting some response, Marcus finally spoke. "Your values," he said, his voice calm but cutting, "are reflected in your actions, not your words. And the actions I've experienced, not just yesterday, but today as well. Tell me everything I need to know." The tension in the room thickened, like an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing second. Thomas's pale face flushed, his discomfort evident as he shifted his weight from foot to foot. He opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I'm not here to embarrass you," Marcus continued, his voice steady and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of his conviction. "This isn't about making a scene. It's about ensuring that no one else walks out of here feeling the way I did yesterday, dismissed, humiliated, and devalued." The quiet intensity in Marcus's voice silenced the room. The employees who had tried to fade into the background stood motionless, their gazes locked on the unfolding scene. Customers, some still holding brochures, whispered among themselves, their curiosity giving way to an uneasy empathy as they recognized the significance of the moment. Thomas cleared his throat, his discomfort morphing into a semblance of resolve. "I understand, Mr. Carter, and as the manager of this dealership, I take full responsibility. I would like to personally handle your purchase to ensure that you have the experience you deserve." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful but firm. "I appreciate the gesture," he said, his tone softening just enough to convey sincerity. "But this isn't about me getting special treatment. It's about changing the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." Thomas blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. Marcus pressed on, his voice now carrying the quiet authority of someone who had fought too hard to let this moment slip through his fingers. "This isn't just an isolated incident. It's a pattern, one I'd seen in the reviews of your dealership and in the stories of others who've experienced the same treatment. Gestured toward Rachel, who handed Thomas a packet of documents. These are examples of what I'm talking about. Complaints from customers, mostly minorities, who've walked through these doors and been made to feel like they don't belong. This isn't just about one bad interaction, it's about a culture. Thomas glanced at the packet, flipping through its contents, his face growing more strained with each page. The reviews Marcus had compiled were damning, painting a picture of a dealership that consistently failed to provide equitable service. What do you suggest we do?" Thomas asked finally, his voice tinged with resignation. Marcus didn't hesitate. "First, diversity and bias training for every employee. It's not enough to apologize. You need to ensure your team understands how to treat every customer with respect and dignity. Second, I want to see a partnership with organizations that focus on equity and inclusion. Use your platform to make a difference beyond this showroom. And third, implement clear accountability measures so this behavior doesn't continue unchecked." Thomas nodded slowly, his earlier defensiveness replaced by a sense of reluctant acceptance. "Those are reasonable steps," he said. "We'll work on implementing them immediately." "I'll be following up," Marcus said, his gaze steady. "Not just for my sake, but for everyone who has ever walked in here and been judged before they even had a chance to speak." The manager's shoulders slumped slightly, his tension giving way to a cautious nod. "Understood. You have my word that we'll do everything we can to make this right." The room remained silent as Marcus turned toward the gathered onlookers, his voice now addressing more than just Thomas. "This isn't about tearing anyone down," he said, his tone firm but compassionate. "It's about building something better for all of us." The quiet murmurs of the crowd grew louder as Marcus began to leave, Rachel and Rebecca following close behind. The glass doors swung open, the sunlight flooding in as Marcus stepped out, his shoulders squared and his steps purposeful. He hadn't just confronted the past, he had laid the foundation for a future that demanded respect, accountability, and change. The tension in the room was palpable as Marcus stood his ground, his calm yet commanding presence filling the space. Thomas, still clutching the packet of documents Rachel had handed him, shifted uncomfortably. The weight of the moment was unmistakable. Every employee and customer in the dealership had their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, and Rebecca's camera captured it all. "I'm willing to move forward with this purchase," Marcus began, his voice measured but firm. "But only under specific conditions. This isn't just about me buying a car. It's about ensuring that what happened yesterday doesn't happen again to anyone." Thomas swallowed, the beads of sweat forming on his brow betraying his unease. What conditions are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice tentative, though he already knew he had little room to push back. Rachel stepped forward again, her professional demeanor unwavering, and placed a second folder on the desk in front of Thomas. "This proposal outlines everything we're asking for," she said, her tone neutral but authoritative. "First and foremost, comprehensive diversity and bias training for every staff member, starting with the sales team." Thomas hesitated, his fingers lightly brushing the edge of the folder, but he made no move to open it. Marcus stepped closer, his gaze locking onto Thomas's. "This isn't optional," Marcus said. "You can't fix a problem unless you acknowledge it exists. Bias, whether conscious or unconscious, undermines the integrity of your business and the trust of your customers." Rachel continued, pointing to the next section of the proposal. "Second, we're asking for clear protocols to address discrimination. That means a defined process for handling complaints, complete transparency in how they're resolved, and accountability measures to ensure incidents like this aren't swept under the rug." Thomas nodded slowly, though his discomfort was evident. "And the third condition?" he asked, his voice low, as though he feared the answer. Marcus gestured to Rachel, who didn't miss a beat. "We've outlined a partnership with a local nonprofit that specializes in workplace equity. They'll assist in implementing these changes and provide ongoing support to ensure this isn't just a one-time effort, but a sustained commitment." Thomas's eyes darted toward the camera, the lens capturing every bead of sweat, every twitch of his lips as he processed the weight of the demands. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Marcus could feel the eyes of the gathered customers boring into both him and the dealership's manager. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "This isn't just for me, Thomas. This is an opportunity for your dealership to lead by example, to show that you're willing to do more than apologize, that you're willing to change." Thomas exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging under the pressure. "I'll need to consult with our regional office on some of these, he began, but Marcus's sharp gaze cut him off. "With all due respect," Marcus said, his tone firm, "there's no time for bureaucracy. The changes we're asking for are not revolutionary. They're necessary, and they're long overdue." Rebecca, the reporter, took a step closer, her notepad in hand. "Thomas," she said, her voice professional but insistent, "the eyes of this community are on you right now. How do you plan to respond?" Thomas blinked, clearly aware that his hesitation would not reflect well under the watchful lens of the camera. He glanced around the room, taking in the faces of customers who had paused mid-purchase to watch the exchange. The weight of public scrutiny hung heavy in the air. After a long pause, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but resigned. "We'll implement the changes you're asking for. The diversity training, the protocols, the partnership. We'll do it all." Rachel handed him a pen, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Sign here, acknowledging your agreement to the conditions. We'll keep a copy for our records, and we'll expect regular updates on your progress." Thomas hesitated again, but finally took the pen, signing the document with slow, deliberate strokes. The act, though simple, felt monumental in the charged atmosphere of the room. Marcus's calm, unyielding demeanor left no room for negotiation, and Thomas knew he had no other option. As he handed the signed document back to Rachel, the manager forced a small smile. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," he said, though his voice carried an undertone of frustration. "We'll do our best to meet your expectations." Marcus nodded, his expression softening just enough to convey sincerity. "This isn't about my expectations, Thomas. It's about setting a standard of respect and equity that every customer deserves. I'll be following up to make sure the changes are implemented." The cameraman captured the final moments as Marcus turned to Rachel and Rebecca. "Let's finalize the purchase," he said, his tone signaling a return to business. As the papers were signed and the transaction completed, the dealership's staff remained subdued, their earlier dismissive attitudes replaced with tense professionalism. The customers who had gathered began to disperse, their hushed conversations filled with admiration for Marcus's composure and determination. As Marcus stepped out into the sunlight, the keys to his dream car in hand, he felt a sense of accomplishment. This wasn't just about buying a car. It was about creating change, about standing up for himself and others who had been silenced or dismissed. The battle wasn't over, but this victory was a step in the right direction. Marcus sat down at the dealership's negotiation table, his calm demeanor unshaken as the sales manager laid out the final documents. The electric sedan he had chosen was the pinnacle of modern design and technology, a sleek, powerful machine that matched his vision of success. He had spent years dreaming of this moment, And now, as he customized every feature of the car, he poured a little of himself into every decision. The color, obsidian black with a matte finish, striking yet understated. The interior, premium leather in a deep caramel tone, a nod to both luxury and warmth. The rims, the sound system, the custom dashboard, each choice reflected not just his taste, but the long journey that had brought him here. This was more than a car. It was a symbol of how far he had come. As Marcus finalized his selections, the staff hovered nearby, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by an eagerness that bordered on obsequious. Rick, the salesman who had mocked him, now lingered silently in the background, his usual smugness replaced by a quiet unease. The others were quick with smiles and offers of assistance, though their exaggerated politeness was tinged with something disingenuous. Marcus could feel it, a desperate attempt to salvage their reputation in the face of the public spectacle that had unfolded. The energy in the room was different now. Where there had been condescension and doubt, there was now an air of forced professionalism. Marcus recognized it for what it was: damage control. They weren't treating him with respect because they wanted to. They were doing it because they had to. And while the shift was satisfying in one sense, it was also a reminder of how far the dealership still had to go. Thomas returned with the final paperwork, his movements brisk and efficient. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone now carefully neutral, "we have everything ready for your signature. Once that's complete, the car will be prepared for delivery." Marcus took the pen and began signing the documents, his focus unwavering. Each signature felt like another step toward reclaiming not just his dignity, but the narrative of the day. He could feel the eyes of the staff on him, their forced smiles a stark contrast to the genuine respect he deserved but had to demand. As he reached the final page, Thomas hesitated, his expression faltering for a brief moment. "I want to thank you again for bringing those concerns to our attention," he said, his voice quieter, as though trying to convey sincerity. "We truly want to ensure every customer feels valued." Marcus looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. "Good," he replied evenly, "because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else walks through those doors and leaves feeling less than they are." The words hung in the air, and Thomas nodded quickly, fumbling slightly as he collected the signed documents. Marcus could see the unease in his eyes, the weight of knowing that promises had been made under the watchful lens of the camera, and that Marcus wouldn't let them be forgotten. With the paperwork complete, Marcus rose from his seat, his movements deliberate and composed. Rachel handed him a copy of the signed agreement, and he slipped it into his leather portfolio without a word. The silence in the room was heavy, punctuated only by the faint hum of the showroom's background music. "Your car will be ready shortly," Thomas said, his tone a little too eager. "Would you like a coffee or anything while you wait?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied, his voice polite but firm. He had no intention of lingering longer than necessary. This was his victory, and he refused to let their feigned politeness diminish it. As the staff worked to prepare the car, Marcus moved toward the large glass windows overlooking the lot. The sunlight streamed in, glinting off the rows of luxury vehicles, and he allowed himself a moment to reflect. This wasn't just about the car, though it was a milestone he deeply appreciated. It was about standing up for himself and setting a precedent for others who had been dismissed, underestimated, or made to feel unwelcome. When the car was finally ready, it was wheeled to the front of the dealership, its gleaming black exterior drawing admiring looks from customers and staff alike. Marcus stepped forward, running a hand along the smooth surface, the weight of the moment sinking in. This car was more than a purchase. It was a symbol of perseverance, of refusing to be defined by someone else's limited perspective. Thomas approached again, his smile tight but present. "Congratulations, Mr. Carter. I hope you enjoy your new vehicle." Marcus nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Thank you," he said simply, then paused for a moment before adding, "I'll be checking in on the progress you've promised. Actions speak louder than words." Thomas swallowed, his smile faltering slightly. "Of course. We'll be in touch." With that, Marcus stepped into his car, the door closing with a satisfying click. The interior was as luxurious as he had envisioned, every detail exactly as he had chosen. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, the feel of it solid and reassuring, and started the engine. The soft purr of the motor was a reminder of everything he had worked for, every challenge he had overcome. As he pulled out of the dealership lot, the staff watched in silence, their earlier smugness now replaced with something closer to humility. Marcus didn't look back. This moment wasn't just about what he had gained. It was about what he had proven, to them and to himself. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the segment aired on the local news. Rebecca Lynn's crisp voice introduced the story, her tone blending professionalism with just the right amount of indignation to captivate viewers. The footage unfolded dramatically, Marcus walking into the dealership, flanked by his team, the tense confrontation with the staff, and the quiet conviction in his voice as he demanded accountability. The camera lingered on Marcus as he spoke, his calm but resolute words resonating with a clarity that was impossible to ignore. Interviews with bystanders and customers who had witnessed the event were interspersed with clips of Rachel outlining the proposed changes for the dealership. The broadcast was polished yet raw, capturing not just the incident, but the broader implications of what it represented. By the time the segment concluded, the story had already begun spreading beyond the local community, and social media lit up with reactions as viewers shared the clip, adding their own thoughts and experiences. Within hours, hashtags like "respect in business" and "bias in customer service" were trending, with Marcus's name and face at the center of the conversation. Messages flooded Marcus's inbox, each one carrying its own weight. There were notes of encouragement, stories from others who had faced similar prejudice, and expressions of gratitude for his courage to stand up and demand change. Marcus read each message carefully, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He realized that his experience wasn't just his own. It was shared by countless others who had endured the same indignities and silence. One message in particular stood out. It came from a woman named Denise, a single mother who recounted an eerily similar encounter at a different dealership. "I didn't have the words to defend myself at the time," she wrote, "but watching your story gave me hope. Thank you for standing up for all of us." The weight of her words settled over Marcus, solidifying his resolve. What had started as a personal mission to reclaim his dignity had grown into something larger, a movement that challenged businesses to confront their biases and create spaces where all customers were treated with respect. The public response wasn't limited to social media. Local newspapers picked up the story, adding context about the broader issue of discrimination in customer service. Editorials praised Marcus for his poise and determination, calling his actions a wake-up call for businesses everywhere. National outlets began to take notice, reaching out for interviews and commentaries. Marcus found himself at the center of a conversation he hadn't fully anticipated, but was ready to lead. Meanwhile, Sterling Motors faced intense scrutiny. Their social media pages were inundated with comments demanding accountability, with customers vowing to take their business elsewhere unless real changes were made. The dealership released a public statement acknowledging the incident and promising to implement the measures Marcus had outlined. They framed it as a commitment to rebuilding trust and ensuring equitable treatment for all customers. But the public's response was mixed. Many viewed the statement as a reaction to the backlash rather than a genuine desire for change. For Marcus, the days that followed were a whirlwind. Rebecca's segment continued to gain traction, and interview requests poured in from podcasts, radio shows, and community panels. He approached each opportunity with the same calm determination he had displayed at the dealership, using his platform to amplify the voices of those who had reached out to him. In one interview, he reflected on the experience. "This isn't just about one dealership," he said. "It's about a mindset. A way of thinking that says some people are less deserving of respect based on nothing but assumptions. That mindset needs to change, not just here, but everywhere." The interviewer leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "What do you hope businesses take away from this?" Marcus paused before answering. "I hope they realize that accountability isn't optional. Customers notice. Communities notice. And when you treat people with disrespect, it's not just bad for your reputation, it's bad for humanity. Respect isn't a privilege, it's a baseline." The response to his words was overwhelming. Organizations began reaching out, asking Marcus to speak to their employees or consult on equity initiatives. The nonprofit he had partnered with as part of the dealership agreement reported a surge in interest from other businesses seeking guidance on diversity training and anti-bias programs. What had started as a local incident was growing into a larger movement. But for Marcus, the most meaningful impact came in the form of personal connections. The messages from people like Denise, the conversations with those who shared their own experiences, and the gratitude from community leaders reminded him why he had taken a stand. He hadn't just changed the narrative at one dealership. He had sparked a broader conversation about respect, equity, and accountability. As the days turned into weeks, Marcus continued to champion the cause, balancing his work as an entrepreneur with his newfound role as an advocate for change. His actions had shown that even a single voice, when used with purpose, could create ripples that reached far beyond the immediate moment. And as he drove his sleek electric sedan through the city streets, its quiet hum a reminder of his journey, Marcus knew this was only the beginning. The work was far from over, but he was ready for it. After all, he wasn't just driving a car, he was driving change. The backlash against Sterling Motors was swift and unforgiving. Social media became a storm of outrage, with posts and tweets condemning the dealership's treatment of Marcus and others like him. Customers shared their own stories of being dismissed or disrespected at Sterling Motors, creating a cascade of testimonials that painted a damning picture of the dealership's culture. "Sterling Motors needs to do better," read one viral tweet. "Respect shouldn't depend on how someone looks when they walk in the door." Within days, the dealership's social media accounts were inundated with comments demanding accountability. Hashtags like "Change at Sterling" and "Bias in Business" trended, drawing the attention of local and national news outlets. Sterling Motors had no choice but to respond. They issued a carefully worded public apology, acknowledging the incident with Marcus and promising to implement the changes he had proposed. But Marcus knew that an apology wasn't enough. Words could only go so far, and he wanted to ensure that the promises Sterling Motors made weren't just a reaction to bad press, but a genuine commitment to change. He reached out to the nonprofit he had partnered with, suggesting a broader initiative to address workplace equity, not just at the dealership but throughout the city. The nonprofit eagerly embraced the idea, and together they launched a campaign called Equity in Action. The campaign focused on providing resources for businesses to examine their policies, implement diversity training, and create systems of accountability to address discrimination. Marcus worked closely with the organization, using his platform to amplify the message. The campaign was promoted through social media, community events, and partnerships with local businesses, The response was immediate and encouraging. Small businesses began reaching out, eager to participate in workshops and training sessions. Larger companies, some of which had their own histories of public controversies, joined the initiative to demonstrate their commitment to equity. Marcus's story had become a catalyst, inspiring a movement that extended far beyond the walls of Sterling Motors. Meanwhile, Sterling Motors made good on their promise to implement change. The dealership announced a partnership with the nonprofit and began rolling out the diversity training Marcus had insisted on. Social media updates showcased their progress, photos of staff attending workshops, statements from employees about the importance of the initiative, and testimonials from customers who noted a visible shift in the dealership's atmosphere. Despite these steps, Marcus didn't let up. He scheduled regular follow-ups with the nonprofit to ensure the dealership remained on track. He also worked with community leaders to monitor the campaign's impact, gathering data and feedback to measure progress. The ripple effect continued to grow. Other businesses, emboldened by Marcus's example, began scrutinizing their own practices. Restaurants, retail stores, and service providers started implementing similar changes, recognizing that treating customers with respect wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. Marcus became a sought-after speaker, invited to share his story and insights at community forums, corporate events, and even local community meetings. In one memorable speech, he addressed a room full of business leaders. "Equity isn't a buzzword," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's the foundation of trust. If your customers don't feel valued, you've already failed. The question isn't whether you should change, it's whether you're willing to do the work." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus remained grounded. He knew that real change required more than speeches and workshops. It required sustained effort and accountability. His nonprofit partnership expanded its reach, establishing an online portal where businesses could access resources, share best practices, and connect with experts. The impact of Marcus's actions reached beyond businesses, inspiring individuals as well. People who had felt powerless in the face of bias found courage in his story. Community groups formed to tackle issues of inequity in other sectors, from housing to education. Marcus was humbled by the outpouring of support, but he always redirected the focus to the collective effort. "This isn't about me," he often said. "It's about what we can accomplish together." Months later, as Marcus reviewed the latest data from the campaign, he felt a sense of pride in how far they had come. Sterling Motors, once a symbol of dismissiveness and bias, had transformed into a case study for progress. While there was still work to be done, the dealership was now a partner in the movement, actively advocating for the very changes Marcus had demanded. The ripple effect was undeniable. Marcus had set out to stand up for himself in a moment of disrespect, but his actions had sparked something far greater, a movement that challenged businesses to be better, inspired communities to unite, and reminded everyone that respect and equity should never be negotiable. Marcus sat on his balcony, the city lights stretching out before him, like a blanket of stars. The night air was cool and carried the faint sounds of distant traffic, a symphony of life that somehow felt quieter tonight. In the stillness, he found space to think, to breathe, to process everything that had happened. The journey played out in his mind like a film reel. He thought of the anger that had bubbled up when Rick had sneered at him, the sting of being reduced to someone's narrow assumption. It wasn't the first time he'd faced prejudice, but it had been one of the most blatant. For a moment, he had questioned whether it was worth pushing back, whether it was easier to let the moment pass and keep his dignity intact. But something deeper had compelled him to act. Confronting the dealership hadn't been easy. Marcus had felt the weight of countless eyes on him, some curious, some skeptical, and others outright hostile. He'd walked into the room knowing that his presence alone was a challenge to the status quo. Yet he had stood firm, not out of anger, but out of a need to demand the respect he deserved, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen or underestimated. What struck Marcus most in hindsight wasn't just the confrontation itself, but the ripple effects it had created. The messages he'd received, filled with gratitude and shared experiences, were proof that this wasn't just his fight. There were countless others who had walked into rooms like that showroom and faced the same dismissive attitudes, the same judgments based on nothing but surface-level assumptions. His actions had resonated far beyond the dealership's glass walls. As he sat in the quiet, Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled through the emails he had saved from strangers who had reached out. Each message told a story. A woman who had been ignored at a bank counter. A young man denied a job interview despite being overqualified. A father humiliated in front of his children at a high-end store. Their words painted a picture of a world that still had far to go. One email in particular caught his attention. It was from a teenager named James, who had written, "I saw your story on the news, and it made me think about the times I've stayed quiet when people disrespected me. Seeing you stand up for yourself made me realize I don't have to accept that. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." Marcus read the words twice, his chest tightening with emotion. It was easy to focus on the larger movement, the partnerships, and the changes happening in businesses across the city, but messages like James's reminded him of the personal impact. This wasn't just about systemic change. It was about inspiring individuals to believe in their own worth, to demand better for themselves. He leaned back in his chair, letting his mind drift to the future. The fight against prejudice and bias was far from over, but he felt ready for it. He thought about the nonprofit partnership, the workshops they were rolling out, and the businesses that had reached out, eager to do better. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time, Marcus felt like they were moving in the right direction. Turning his gaze back to the city lights, Marcus reflected on what he had learned through it all. He had learned that moments of pain could be transformed into opportunities for growth, and that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about acting despite the fear. Most importantly, he had learned the power of his own voice and the change it could inspire when used with purpose. What had started as a painful, humiliating experience had become something meaningful, something powerful. Marcus had turned a moment of indignity into a movement that challenged people to be better, to think deeper, and to see each other with more respect. The fight wasn't over, but tonight, Marcus allowed himself a moment of pride. The city stretched on before him, endless and full of possibility. Marcus exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He was ready for whatever came next. After all, this wasn't just a personal victory. It was a step toward building a world where everyone was seen, valued, and respected. Months later, the showroom at Sterling Motors had a different energy. Gone was the dismissive air of superiority that had once clouded its halls. The glossy cars still shone under the showroom lights, but the focus today wasn't on sales. Instead, the staff had gathered in the main presentation area, their usual uniforms replaced by casual business attire as they prepared for a session unlike any other. Marcus Carter walked into the room, greeted by polite nods and tentative smiles. The hostility and condescension he had faced months ago had been replaced with something new, a mix of respect and curiosity. He wasn't here as a customer this time, but as an invited speaker for the dealership's inaugural diversity training program, a program that had grown out of the demands he had made that fateful day. As he stepped up to the podium, Marcus took a moment to look around the room. Rick was there, sitting in the back, his posture stiff and his gaze averted. Thomas, the manager, sat in the front row, his notepad already open, ready to take notes. The rest of the staff filled the space, their expressions a mix of anticipation and quiet introspection. Good morning, Marcus began, his voice steady but warm. Thank you for having me here today. I'll be honest, standing here feels surreal. A few months ago, I walked into this dealership hoping to purchase a car, and I left feeling humiliated. But I also left determined. Determined to make sure that what happened to me wouldn't happen to anyone else. The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Marcus continued, his tone softening slightly. I'm not here to dwell on the past or to point fingers. I'm here because I believe in growth. I believe that we all have the capacity to learn, to do better, and to treat each other with the respect we all deserve. He paused, letting his words sink in. The staff leaned forward slightly, their attention fixed on him. Even Rick, though clearly uncomfortable, was listening intently. When I walked in that day, Marcus said, "You didn't see me. You saw assumptions, you saw stereotypes, and because of that you dismissed me before I even had a chance to speak. But here's the thing, every customer who walks through those doors has a story. Every person you interact with has hopes, struggles, and dreams, just like you. And it's your job, as professionals and as people, to meet them with respect and empathy." Thomas nodded subtly, his expression thoughtful. The rest of the staff remained quiet, their faces a mix of reflection and, for some, regret. Marcus shifted his stance, his voice growing more hopeful. "The fact that I'm here today, that you've invited me to speak, shows me that you're willing to change, and that matters. Because creating a culture of respect doesn't just benefit your customers, it benefits all of you. It builds trust, strengthens relationships, and fosters a workplace where everyone can thrive." He glanced at Rachel, who stood near the back of the room, observing with a small, encouraging smile. Her presence reminded Marcus of how far they had come since that first confrontation. Together they had turned a moment of indignity into an opportunity for growth, not just for the dealership, but for the broader community. Marcus finished his speech by sharing stories of the impact his actions had sparked. He talked about the businesses that had reached out to implement their own equity programs, the individuals who had been inspired to stand up for themselves, and the nonprofit partnership that continued to grow. He ended with a challenge. Let today be the start of something meaningful. Let it be the moment you choose to see people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. The room erupted into applause, not loud or boisterous, but steady and heartfelt. Marcus stepped down from the podium, shaking hands with Thomas and a few others who approached him, their gratitude genuine. As the session concluded, Marcus took one last look around the room. The staff's expressions were no longer guarded or skeptical. Instead, they seemed thoughtful, even determined. Rick, who had lingered near the back, approached Marcus hesitantly. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice quiet but earnest, "I just wanted to say thank you for giving us a chance to do better." Marcus nodded, his own expression softening. "It's never too late to grow," he replied. As he left the dealership that day, Marcus felt a profound sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about the policies that had changed or the training that had been implemented. It was about the people, the hearts and minds that had been touched, the seeds of empathy and respect that had been planted. Driving away in his electric sedan, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He hadn't just confronted a moment of injustice. He had sparked a legacy of change. And as the city skyline came into view, he felt a deep sense of hope for the world he was helping to create.